Welcome. My name is Mark Gonzalez. I'm the president of MEPSI, Mexico Elmhurst Philatelic Society International. MEPSI is an international organization dedicated to the study of the stamps of Mexico. What you are about to view is a video made by Ron Mitchell about the Denver Eagles stamp issue of Mexico. It has been digitized from an original VHS tape and many of the images replaced to improve the quality. Ron originally made the video in the mid-1990s and was considered the world's authority on this stamp issue. I will give more information about Ron and the video at its conclusion. Please enjoy the Denver Eagles.
(1913) Civil War in Mexico, the first social revolution of the century. In a nation of 12 million, it has been estimated 1 million were killed. It was a struggle for land reform, a movement to divide huge privately owned farmlands among the campesinos, or peasants. Hello, I'm Ron Mitchell. We'll be looking at more old film and postage stamps of Mexico in the next few minutes to help tell the story of one particular group of stamps, an ordinary enough-looking group of stamps, but since they were in the middle of that terrible war, they hold a special attraction and significance. Mexico, 1914. The Denver Eagles. Before we get to who, where, when, why, and how of the Denver Eagles, let's focus on what, starting at the top of the main design and working our way down. Correos, the plural of correo, meaning postage, post, post office, or mail. Then, in a semicircle, Gobierno Constitucionalista, or constitutional government. More on that later. Next, we have an eagle with a snake in its mouth sitting on a cactus growing out of a rock on an island. A similar design is the official national coat of arms of Mexico. The country is sometimes called the Land of Eagle and Serpent. That's because legend has it that a god told the Aztecs to look for such a scene. And when they found it, they were to build a city. It's where Mexico City is now. The next thing in the design is the word Mexico, or Mexico in Spanish. It comes from an Aztec language, a combination of two words, Mechi, which is a name the Aztecs called themselves, the Mexica, and Co, which is a locator meaning the place of. So Mexico is the place of the Mexica. Finally in the design, the face value, 100 centavos equals 1 peso. The peso goes back hundreds of years to the Spanish Empire. It's the prototype of the U.S. silver dollar, and for many years the exchange ratio with the dollar was 2 pesos to 1 U.S. dollar. Today, a peso is worth less than a penny. Here's some background on what was going on at about the time the Denver Eagles were ordered. General Victoriano Huerta was heading up a military dictatorship out of Mexico City. He represented the federal government. His troops were called the Federales, or Federals. Huerta's opponents called themselves Constitucionalistas, or Constitutionalists. They were the rebels in the Civil War. The rebels' first chief was Venustiano Carranza. His most successful general was the legendary Pancho Villa. Carranza was on a trip over the mountains during most of March 1914. He was moving his provisional government capital from Hermosillo to Juarez. Villa was in the state of Chihuahua. And Emiliano Zapata, who was fighting for the same cause, was in the mountains south of Mexico City. Part of the rebels' struggle was to provide the movement's own internal revenue in postage stamps and currency in territory they controlled, so their monetary resources would clearly be labeled as theirs. These stamps are examples of how, for a period of about 3 years, beginning in May of 1913, there were several stamp issues for the rebels' use. The Denver Eagles, both the postage stamps and the internal revenue stamps, are included in that group of issues. Here's where they were printed: the Smith Brooks Printing Company in Denver. The Arco Building with the Marriott Hotel between 17th and 18th on California in downtown Denver occupies most of the spot where the old Smith Brooks building used to be. And this is the spot, this very spot, where the presses rolled to produce the Denver Eagles. And here's how Smith Brooks wound up with the job, apparently the only stamps ever printed in Denver for a foreign government. Orville Smith's daughter kept a scrapbook that tells part of the story. Smith's grandson, Lou Huff, has the scrapbook now. It's full of pictures and articles from the early 1900s. One tattered and torn newspaper article tells of the visit to Denver of one Senor Salvador Catano. A microfilm of the Rocky Mountain News for March 10, 1914, gives the whole article. Catano was reportedly in Denver on a secret mission. He was described as a commissioner of the Constitutionalists. There are pictures of Catano and his friend, Huff's father, Louis. The younger Huff was only 9 years old at the time, but he says he remembers Catano's visit vividly. He is convinced that Catano brought orders for printing money for Mexico. Huff says his understanding all his life has been that there were two types of bills printed, one for the Constitutionalists and one for the federal government. He says he remembers seeing them both, and also remembers that in the lower left corner the name Smith Brooks was printed, or SB, or Litho, or some such. But experts in Mexican money have not been aware until recently that Smith Brooks was a source for bills. There is ample evidence the company printed currency, but it is not clear whether it was a new design or, more likely, a second printing from plates produced by another firm. So Smith Brooks received an order for money, internal revenue, and postage stamps in about March of 1914, and the order was placed through friends who were also business connections. Co-founder Smith's son-in-law, Dr. Louis Huff, was a surgeon who worked in Mexico and made friends with Catano, who in turn reportedly was a close friend of Carranza. It appears at least two other printers in the United States tried to get the job of printing the stamps and money for the Mexican rebels. George Ward Lynn, founder of Lynn's Stamp News, wrote in a book in 1917 titled The War Stamps of Mexico that shortly after the revolution started, W.M. Lynn & Sons Printing Company of Columbus, Ohio, was approached by the Constitutionalists to print stamps, after an influential personal friend in Mexico made known Lynn's desire to obtain a printing contract. Lynn & Sons sent a sample of a design for use in the state of Sonora, but by the time it was received, the rebels' territory had grown to the point where such a stamp was no longer appropriate. Meanwhile, the order for the so-called Transitorio issue was given to Maverick Clark Litho Company of San Antonio. Transitorio translates temporary, referring to a temporary government. The stamps were the first ones printed for general use throughout Constitutionalist territory. Maverick Clark printed revenue stamps and money at about the same time. To depart from the main story for a moment, it's interesting to note that the Transitorios overprinted Victoria Torreon were Mexico's first commemorative issues. Pancho Villa's troops ran the Federales out of Torreon on April 2, 1914, and it was considered a great victory for the rebels. This 5-centavo on piece is canceled in Juarez, April 3rd. In any event, supplies of Transitorios began to run short, especially the lower values, and some 10 centavos were bisected to make the 5-centavo first-class rate. This one was canceled in Nogales on July 19th, one day before the Denvers were reportedly delivered to the town. It's unclear why Maverick Clark didn't print more Transitorios when supplies began to run short as Constitutionalist territory continued to grow. Perhaps it was political pull, but whatever, the Constitutionalists again turned to Lynn, and Lynn & Sons was asked to reproduce the Transitorios. Lynn agreed to do the job for 25 cents a thousand. A month later, when he sent 75,000 as samples, his price went down. He agreed to print more for 12.5 cents per thousand. Lynn's stamps were perforated, while the originals were rouletted. He sent the samples to Hermosillo, and they were pressed into service on mail. The rebel stamps weren't technically valid for international postage, so on this cover, a U.S. 2-cent stamp was added for first-class postage to Arizona. Remember, Lynn had sent the 75,000 samples to Hermosillo, and as luck had it, Carranza was in the process of moving his provisional government to Juarez, a trip over the mountains that took a month. The head of the Department of Communications, Ignacio Bonillas, was apparently on that trip, and by the time Lynn tried to get a letter directly to Bonillas about the print job, it was too late. Smith Brooks had the order. Stamp collector Noble DeRoyne of Lakewood, Colorado, did some digging into the background of the Denver Eagles in 1954 and 55. DeRoyne was an advertising man at the Denver Post, a part-time stamp dealer, and an enthusiastic collector of Mexico. Much of what he learned back then came from John Brooks, son of co-founder George Brooks. John was 28 years old and working at the printing plant in 1914. DeRoyne wrote a paper on what he found out. It tells a different and suspiciously adventurous version of how the stamps were ordered. The paper says a fella named Doran sold the job, and sure enough, there in the Denver City Directory for 1914, there's Will Duran, name spelled wrong, but listed as a salesman for Smith Brooks. Duran's paper says Doran hunted up Pancho Villa and sold the print job, and that Doran was said to have been one of few gringos Villa liked. Further, it says Villa gave Smith Brooks trouble when it came time to collect on the printing bill. It's reported Villa was hard to track down. The entire amount was never collected, and the account finally had to be chalked off the books as a bad job. Now, Duran was relating what people had told him from Smith Brooks 40 years earlier. Villa was portrayed by the American press as the most colorful of the Mexican generals. He certainly was the most memorable, and records from the State Department's National Archives in Washington, D.C. would tend to lend some support to the notion Villa did the ordering. This is a telegram received by Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan on April 10, 1914. It was sent by George Carruthers, on the right here, Bryan's man assigned to watch Villa, on the left, in Mexico. Carruthers wired Bryan, "I foresee many complications ahead. Villa continues to act independently of Carranza in all branches, purchasing all supplies, arms, ammunition, and equipment through his own commercial agency in Juarez." That could mean postage stamps. The telegram also says, Carranza has not assumed control of anything so far. This set of labels also lends some weight to the Villa ordering theory. Collectors who have studied them generally agree Villa did order them from the Ellis Brothers Printing Company in El Paso. The outer design is the same as the Denver's, except it's a bit smaller. The man in the middle is Francisco Madero. He was credited with starting the revolution, but wound up being assassinated. The stamps were printed late in 1914, after Villa split with Carranza. More about that split in a few minutes. Villa reportedly headed south by the time the stamps were ready for delivery, so they were never officially used on any mail. But they do serve as proof Villa apparently did get involved in ordering some stamps. Still, there's good reason to believe Carranza's head of communications, Bonillas, did the ordering of the Denvers. For one thing, Bonillas was the most logical person to place such an order. Also, the Denver Eagles have a small mark under the cactus at the tip of this marker, which may be Bonillas' initials. Here's what the mark looks like: a stylized YB, which could stand for Ignacio Bonillas. Villa or Bonillas? Common sense points toward Bonillas, but the Villa story is a lot more fun. The Smith Brooks printing plant was very capable of handling the job. Their ads of the period boasted that only 7 other plants in the United States were better equipped. Harry Seidenstricker was the artist. If artwork was done at Smith Brooks, Huff is certain Seidenstricker did it. There were stories going around Denver in the 40s and 50s that stones were used in the printing process. A couple of collectors, the noted William W. Wiley and Noble DeRoyne, went on treasure hunts for the stones. They were supposedly being used in the foundation of a building somewhere in downtown Denver, or had been tossed somewhere in the mountains. Well, the odds are there were no stones, or was no stone, to find. It's certain the stamps were printed from zinc offset plates, a fairly new process at the time that gave beautiful results. If stones were involved in the transferring process, they were very likely reused. The zinc plates would have been reused too. A 1917 ad shows Smith Brooks had the equipment to do photographic lithography, in which case there would have been no stones. Guide marks at the top and bottom of each vertical row between them suggest a transferring process was done in vertical strips of 10 stamps. The job was done on a 1908 Harris offset press, with ink going from the plate to a rubber mat to the paper. A sheet number was imprinted in the margin. Each sheet was apparently consecutively numbered. The stamps were printed on ready-gummed, unwatermarked paper in sheets of 200 stamps, 20 rows of 10 each. The sheets were cut in half to make panes of 100. They were trimmed at the top and bottom and perforated 12. The perfing was done in the bindery department, by hand, usually 5 or 6 sheets at a time. Some mistakes were made because if a machine jumped, it was liable to perforate an extra row. It was hard to get exacting perfs on a hand-fed machine. This double perfing is known both horizontally and vertically on the 1 centavo value. Here's an example of a minor printing mess-up. Such mistakes are few and far between. There is a small paper fold in the lower right corner on this 15 centavo value imperf pair. The smears on 2 stamps in this block of 9 were caused by what printers call a blanket smear, or make-ready flaw, and is the result of the wrong pressure on the rubber roller that picked up the ink and passed it along to the zinc plate. Imperfs of all 8 values exist. Some students of revolutionary stamps feel the imperfs are proofs, set ahead of the total order for approval. Other experts feel they are just unfinished and unissued stamps. Brooks told DeRoyne that when the job was done, everything went to Mexico, including imperfs. They could have been culled out of the perforated stamps and later sold into the stamp collector market. Neither Minkus nor Scott mention the 50 centavo without perforations. They acknowledge the other 7 values, but don't price them. Colors of the stamps are fairly consistent, but the human eye has named them many different colors. Different catalogs call the 1 centavo pale blue, turquoise blue, or blue. The 2 centavo is variously referred to as light green, pale green, or green. The 3 centavo is either orange or orange-yellow. The 5 and 10 centavo values are very close in color. In fact, Gibbons calls them both red and Minkus calls them both red rose. Other catalogs call the 5 centavo deep rose and the 10 centavo simply rose. The 15 centavo is called rose lilac and mauve. All catalogs agree that the principal color of the 50 centavo is yellow. Here, though, some catalogs recognize the stamp on the right as a shade, calling it dirty yellow or ochre. The highest value, 1 peso, is violet. Mexico belonged to the Universal Postal Union, but the revolutionaries apparently chose to have just 2 of the Denver Eagles colors conform to the international UPU standards. The 2 centavo was equivalent to U.S. and other countries' 1-cent rates, and the 5 centavo was for first-class postage, equivalent to the U.S. 2-cent rate. A third standard color, blue, used on the 1 centavo doesn't match the U.S. equivalent 5-cent rate. We have to look to quantities issued for stamps immediately before the Denvers in order to guess how many were printed. There are no records on the Smith-Brooks work. Here are the reported quantities for the transitorios. There is good reason to believe these numbers are correct. They are reasonable in light of the design's length of use, the population of constitutionalist territory, and the historic average number of letters mailed per person. By the time the Denvers were ordered, rebel territory had more than doubled and was rapidly expanding, so as a guess, perhaps there were 3 times more Denvers printed than transitorios. This is what printing quantities might have been. At 12.5 cents per thousand, which is what Lynn would have charged, this works out to about a $720 job. As a rough guess, 6 million Denver Eagles were printed. Newspaper accounts in the San Antonio Express and the El Paso Morning Times give several references to currency being delivered to Mexico from printing plants in the United States. San Antonio, Fort Worth, New York City, and Washington, D.C. are all mentioned as places where money was printed, but not a word about Denver or Smith-Brooks, not even in the Denver papers, the Post, Times, or the Rocky Mountain News. Revenue stamps were probably the first of the Denver printings to be delivered. Nearly everything in Mexico was taxed, and stamps were affixed to receipts to prove the taxes had been paid. The revenues were probably delivered in late May, 6 weeks before the postage, and at a time when there was a critical shortage of stamps for mail in some areas. So the revenues were authorized for use as postage. This is a copy of the official order. It came to light in the early 1970s. It's dated June 2nd, 1914 in Saltillo, Coahuila. June 2nd is 3 days after Carranza announced his intention to move the provisional capital of the Constitutionalists to Saltillo. He arrived on June 7th. Each dot on this map represents one of 25 cities where the Denver revenues are known legitimately canceled on mail. 3 states and the Federal District of Mexico City used them. The Mexican National Railway also canceled the revenues on board trains in Coahuila, so the track route is included on the map too. These 2 stamps saw postal duty on a train, the Saltillo to Durango run. The 5 centavo was canceled in June, the 2 centavo on July 1st, 1914. A check of 50 revenues with postal cancellations shows 62% of them were used during July and August, and nearly 90% were used between June and September. A clerk canceled these by writing Cerritos SLP for San Luis Potosi, and August 9, 1914. The 2 centavo had already been overprinted for revenue use in Rio Verde, a town about 40 miles from Cerritos. Here's another unusual cancel. Monclova Sucursal A for Post Office Branch A. It appears most of the revenue covers in the hands of collectors are from the Dead Letter Office. More than 400 of them were found in a lot of 150,000 covers sold to a collector in late 1915. This one is Sabinas, Coahuila, June 18th. Nava, Coahuila, July 12th. Piedras Negras, Coahuila, August 16th. Mexico City, September 23rd. It has been reported the revenues through the 25 centavo value were used on mail, but no 25 centavos are known on cover, and some experts doubt they ever saw legitimate use. The 10 centavo is known on cover prepared by or for philatelists. It appears very few of them were affixed to routine mail. The other four values were more commonly used. The stamps are occasionally found canceled with their talons or heels still attached. It's questionable whether any of these items are legitimate, though. They were not supposed to be used like this in the mails. Once the regular Denver stamps arrived, the postage problem was solved. This is an early cancel, July 15th, from Chihuahua, about 100 miles south of El Paso. Here's a July 23rd cancel out of Nogales. Revolutionary Postmaster General Cosme Hinojosa's book on stamps issued while he was in charge says the Denvers arrived in Nogales on the Arizona border on July 20th. It's addressed to the Economist Stamp Company on Nassau Street in New York City. Here's a cancellation that seems to be extremely rare. It's a military cancel used by Pancho Villa's Army of the North. Translated, the cancel says, Section of Military Posts, Division of the North, October 25, 1914, Robles Brigade, for General Jose Isabel Robles. The Denvers are known on covers canceled in late 1915, but a census of nearly 250 pieces shows their heaviest use was in August and September of 1914. 50% of the sample was used during those 2 months. Nearly 80% were used in the 4 months between July and October. Late usage by 6 of the Denvers are known. This one is canceled January 16, 1915. It appears to be Monterey. Half of the 10 centavo stamp made the first-class rate. Here's some rate information. 1 centavo was good for delivery within the city in which the letter was mailed, the drop rate. 5 centavos was first-class mail for up to 20 grams or 7/10 of an ounce to anywhere in Canada, Cuba, the United States, or Mexico. 10 centavos was the double-weight postage for up to 40 grams or 1.4 ounces. 15 centavos registered a single-weight letter. Higher values were for packages and bulk second-class mail, newspapers, and other periodicals. Many covers from this period have mixed frankings with federal government stamps alongside the Rebels adhesives. There are several reasons. For one thing, the Denvers apparently were never submitted to the Universal Postal Union. It was customary to send sets of stamps to other UPU member countries through the UPU's International Bureau. The definitives of 1910 were considered valid for international mail. The adhesives were sometimes called Universal Postal Union or UPU stamps. The Denvers were officially authorized for use by Hinojosa in Circular Number 17 under the date of July 31st, signed on August 10th. It specifically says 1910 stamps should be put on letters to foreign countries, in addition to the constitutionalist emissions. Here's an example of a cover to the U.S. franked as Hinojosa required. It appears to be to John N. Luff, President of the American Philatelic Society from 1907 to 09, and a member of the original group inducted into the APS Hall of Fame in 1941. It's to New York City. Here's another cover to New York City with just the Rebel stamp. Often, letters without a 1910 stamp were allowed into the U.S. mail stream with no problem. The fact is, the United States didn't officially recognize Mexico's federal government under Huerta any more than it did the rebels under Carranza. Technically, it should have made no difference whether 1910 stamps were affixed or not, but it apparently mattered to some U.S. postal clerks in border towns. These two covers each have 10 centavos worth of Denver revenues. The stamps were thought to be invalid, so the envelopes are stamped postage due. This one is 4 cents due, perhaps a double-weight cover. Here are two covers to Galveston. One has 5 centavos postage, the other 10 centavos. Many letters to the U.S. are franked with 10 centavos, and it seems unlikely they were all double weight. There seems to be no other explanation except confusion about rates by the people involved. Another example of 10 centavos and just rebel stamps. 2 strips of 5 ones on the back of the cover. The address to San Francisco is on the other side. Here's one with 10 centavos to Texas. 3 3-centavo Denvers, and 1 1-centavo 1910 UPU stamp. To be absolutely perfect, there's supposed to be 5 centavos of each. So the cover is missing 4 centavos worth of UPU stamps, and a sharp-eyed U.S. clerk stamped the letter postage due, 2 cents. Sometimes mail within Mexico was double franked to help it reach its destination. This one from Chihuahua to Culiacan might have had to travel through territory controlled by different factions. Cancels indicate it took the letter nearly a month to reach its destination. Here's a different kind of mixed franking and another way to assure delivery in the U.S., the addition of U.S. postage. This letter to Golden, Colorado was canceled in Nacosari, Sonora, where it was mailed, and again in Douglas, Arizona, where it entered the country. This one was franked in an unusual way, especially for the recipient, who was a stamp collector. It has a U.S. registry stamp plate single, Scott number F1, on a U.S. 2-cent Washington stamped envelope, decidedly off-center. This might be considered a triple franking. The U.S. postage wasn't necessary since a federal 5 centavo is on the cover. In the letter inside, the writer acknowledged that he didn't need to put on the U.S. postage. There's a Denver since it was mailed in constitutionalist territory out of Chihuahua, and the 1910 UPU stamp. It's upside down, perhaps conveying a negative attitude toward the Federals on the part of the sender. The cancel says August 14th, a time when the 1910 stamps weren't supposed to be taken from the post office unless they'd been applied to international mail first in the presence of a postal clerk. This eliminated the possibility they would fall into the hands of an opposing army. That problem was solved in some areas by adding overprints, thus giving opponent stamps validity. For example, the large GCM monogram, which stands for Constitutional Government of Mexico. The hand stamp was widely used in territory governed by General Carranza, mostly on the 1910 issue. Overprinting the Denvers didn't make much sense because they already say Constitutionalist on them. But some Denvers were marked. Almost all of them seen today are fakes. Here are provisional overprints and cancels which were applied to the Denvers, each in use for short periods of time in small areas approximately where they are shown on the map. Even the revenues were affected during the time they were used for postage. A purple hand stamp was applied to some of them. It's ECM, standing for Ejército Constitucionalista Mexico, or Constitutional Army of Mexico. The sign was printed on many things, including boxcars. Incidentally, there are reports of stamps being sold out of boxcars on Villa's troop trains. This overprint was used on mail sent by General Obregon's soldiers. EC Transitorio stands for Constitutional Army on Campaign. The hand stamp was applied in Culiacan, the capital of the state of Sinaloa. A large Gobierno Constitucionalista was applied to stamps in several towns in northern Mexico, usually before they were affixed to an envelope. The hand stamp was used more as a cancel on the bottom cover. The Yucatan Overprint exists on the Denvers, but some experts question whether it was purely philatelically inspired. Yucatan was off the beaten path of the Civil War. Next, some provisional cancels. Often a retreating army would sack a town, leaving nothing behind that would be of use to its enemies. They even took postal cancelers. Some postmasters made up their own, such as this one called a Big Mexico. It was used in Nogales for a month or less in August and September 1914. The return address is Nogales, Arizona on this cover, and reflects the common practice of American companies to mail their Mexican mail in Nogales, Sonora, because the postage was cheaper. Another Big Mexico. It's backstamped September 6th. There's no way to tell the date on these covers without a backstamp or sometimes the contents. A provisional cancel from Terrazas, Chihuahua. The envelope wound up in the dead letter office. It was sent to a town in Texas first, then returned to Mexico where it was opened. The name and town of the sender were found, and it was sent back to Jimenez, Chihuahua, where it was originally mailed. There, it was listed at the post office for the writer to pick up. There was no response, and like so many dead letters, it was probably sold to a U.S. stamp dealer as part of a large lot. Another dead letter with a provisional cancel from Quantities, Zacatecas. Look carefully at the 1910 5 centavo below the Denver stamps, and you will see a provisional overprint. The ZM stands for State of Zacatecas, Mexico. It is not known on the Denvers. This is just a regular cancel. It is known from the town of Zacatecas even before the Revolution. It makes for an interesting cover. Another interesting one from a small town in northern Veracruz, Tantoyuca. This could be a provisional cancel. There is some doubt, though. Charcas, San Luis Potosi. Here's a cover I'm happy to have. I've looked for a cover addressed to Denver, and this is as close as I've come to owning one. It's addressed to Senora Petra, Colorado, Lincoln Street. Lincoln was in Denver, and the cover was probably intended to go there. It apparently went no further than Laredo, Texas, though, and was sent back to Mexico City's dead letter office. The two 1910 4-centavo stamps are overprinted out of the Monterrey post office. It reads, Gobierno Constitucionalista, another of the many provisional overprints of the time. No Senora Petra is listed in the Denver phone book or city directory for 1914. But there was a Mrs. Charlotta Petri who lived on Lincoln Street. Could it be? We need to go back to history before we get to the last few overprints. The Constitutionalists succeeded in defeating Dictator Huerta in July of 1914. General Obregon helped General Carranza take over the government for all of Mexico. But Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata weren't satisfied with Carranza's attitude toward land reform. So in December, Mexico was plunged into civil war again. Villa's people were in power in Mexico City in December when another overprint appeared. This time, the GCM stood for Gobierno Convencionista Mexico because Villa called himself a conventionist. The order authorizing its use specifically says it needn't be put on the Denver stamps, but it's estimated perhaps 2 panes of each value were overprinted anyway. This has been called the most extensively forged and faked overprint ever put on Mexican stamps. Every single one of them on these Denvers is apparently a fake. The Carranza government decided on another overprint in 1916 after Villa had been run out of Mexico City for good. Cosme Hinojosa indicated in his book it would have been preferable to issue a new set of stamps, but gummed paper and printing inks were scarce. The Denvers were among several available stocks overprinted and were apparently sold only at the second-class window at the main post office in Mexico City. Scott lists the set, but not in used condition. GPDM stands for Provisional Government of Mexico, apparently referring to an emergency status which existed until a new constitution was ratified in 1917. The overprints are called corbatas, which translates ties. They are also called butterflies. The unsold Denvers had been handled a great deal by this time, and heat and humidity ruined some of them. Here, part of a stamp is stuck over another one. The sheets were salvaged as best could be done for the overprinting, and this was a result. Here are printing figures from a note left by H.C. Hopkins, a stamp collector who wrote many articles about the Revolutionary period. These figures were not included in any of his writings. They were just found in his personal papers, but they look like they could be accurate. We don't know where he got them. There is some question whether the 1 and 2 centavo values with the blue overprint were ever on sale in the post office. They may have been held out and sold as rarities to dealers in the U.S. The same was probably done with the same marking in red on a few values. Postmaster General Hinojosa was soundly criticized for this kind of activity in the philatelic press of the day. Hinojosa apparently tampered with the barril or barrel overprint too. Dark brown was the color on sale at the post office, again just for second-class mail on the Denvers. Green and red ink on the stamps, which at best may be called trial color proofs. This surcharge was applied in 1916 during a period of inflation. Only the 1 and 2 centavo values were involved on the Denvers, and many other stamp designs were also revalued. The barril on Denvers is also known inverted. As far as is known today, this strip of 4 is unique. This was in Hopkins' collection. His write-up explains that the strip of 4 was added to the lower right corner of a sheet as both sheet and the added strip were face down, apparently just before the overprint was applied. This was the last overprint. A few months after it was applied, paper currency which backed up the value was no longer recognized as valid. Only later silver coin-backed stamps were valid. There is one other marking made up and printed by a faker. Carlos Isla was sentenced to 2 years in prison for faking overprints and surcharges. There is no doubt that these are some of his work. Isla even overprinted some of his surcharges, creating double fakes. Which of the overprinted, surcharged, or hand-stamped Denvers are philatelic junk? Which are postally pure as the driven snow? There's a little of each, and some in between on the Denver Eagles. In a moment, some personal notes. First, a list of thank yous to the Aurora Stamp Club, whose members inspired me to put this presentation together. To the many people in the Mexico-Elmhurst Philatelic Society International who have shared their knowledge, time, and materials, especially Nick Follansby, Tony Benz, Roger Chicourse, Jim Gentry, Fred Ingham, Laureen Nielsen, Dale Pulver, Bill Sachs, Tom Todson, and David Warman. To the people at the Western History Department of the Denver Public Library, especially Pam Patrick. Many of the still photographs in the presentation were found in the department's collection. To the University of Sonora and Hermosillo for the old film. Thanks to KUSA-TV, Channel 9 in Denver for use of their equipment. To photographers Don Brookins, John Fosholt, and Bill Ward. And of course, thanks to Mr. Smith and Mr. Brooks. Finally, some personal notes. This set of the Denver issue was purchased at auction when the Cornyn-Geller collection was broken up. Cornyn and Geller decided to collect every stamp listed in the Scott International series, 11 volumes at the time. Over about 6 years in the 1970s, they did it. These Denvers are 8 of 195,219 stamps Stan Cornyn and Murray Geller assembled to fill those 11 internationals. I collect internationals, volumes 1 and 2, so the set is special. Another set was sent to me by longtime stamp dealer Dan Stone in November of 1976. Dan gave me my first job, helping out in his shop in the Denver Theater Building during the summer of 1955, when I was 15. The rebels did win the war. The Constitution that came from their struggle still governs Mexico. The reason collecting the Denver Eagles and other stamps is fun is because collectors can learn so much about fascinating people and events. The attraction is really the stories behind the stamps. Speaking of what's behind the stamps, I wonder why that red star is there, and why part of the paper is blue. I don't know why, but some of the stamps with the butterfly overprint seem to have a thin blue line on the right-hand margin, and the paper color on some of the 1 peso seems to just have the slightest bluish tinge to it. And this Mexico cover, I wonder if it has the same kind of a cancel on it that I don't know.
I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something new about the stamps of Mexico. Growing up and living in Denver, Ron became an avid stamp collector and naturally gravitated to the Denver Eagles issue. Ron was a longtime member of MEPSI and a student of the Mexican Revolution. Ron wrote a handbook on the Denver Eagles in 1984 and revised it in 1986. It was well over 400 pages. Shortly afterwards, he made this video. As a well-known reporter for KUSA 9 News in the 1970s and 1980s, Ron had access to film production equipment and the personality to produce this film. It was shown on TV as well as at MEPSI conventions. In the 1990s, Ron was very active in the formation of the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library here in Denver, which was founded in 1993. He served as president of the library from 2002 to 2008, and he was the editor of their journal from 1997 to 2008. In 2010, Ron wrote the book Mexico's Denver Printing of 1914. This was the second book that was published by the RMPL, the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library, under the leadership of Sergio Lugo. This is the definitive book on the Denver Eagles and garnered a number of gold medal awards in national literature competitions as well as a large vermeil at Brasiliana 2013. Unfortunately, we lost Ron in 2016. This was a great loss to MEPSI and to the library. In 2020, the original VHS tape was located by Sergio Lugo, and with Joe Lynott of the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library restored the video. The video was digitized with certain photos of stamps replaced with clearer images wherever possible. Although not perfect, the video retains its educational value. and interest to stamp collectors and students of the Mexican Revolution. I would like to thank Joe Lynott and Sergio Lugo for the many hours they put into making this digital video possible, and especially to Ron Mitchell. Additional information about MEPSI and the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library can be located at www.mepsi.org, that's mepsi.org, or for the library at www.rmpldenver.org. Thank you.